back to my channel. Today I am doing my wrap-up for the month of April. In April I read 19 books. I think that's the most that I have ever read, and there were no graphic novels in this. A lot of them were audiobooks. I think there were like 10, so that helped a lot. And I was very motivated to get through a couple of books that I felt like I was going to want to unhaul them, which if you saw my last video, I did a big unhaul because I had an appointment to go sell some books, so I wanted to get through some books so I could put them all into this one bundle to try and sell. So that was the extenuating circumstances for this many books. Anyway, okay, let's get into it. Okay, the first book I read was Dead Until Dark by Charlaine Harris. This is the first book in this series. What is the series called? I don't know. But it's what the show True Blood was based on. I found this in a free library. I like vampires. I wanted to see what the fuss was about with the source material. I think I've only seen like 1 or 2 episodes of the show, and that was a long time ago. I didn't really know what to expect. I thought it was going to be like a paranormal romance, but it's like not quite. At least the first book is not. It's a paranormal romance, small town murder mystery. So this features a character named Sookie Stackhouse who has the ability to read minds, and she befriends a vampire named Bill that comes to live in her town. The book refers to the vampire condition and Sookie's mind reading ability as a disability, which I feel weird about, but it does fit in with like my working definition of disability, which is like some kind of condition that impacts your ability to move through the world, to move and live in the world, because the world is not accommodating or is not understanding of how your needs are different than someone else's. So like based on that description, it kind of fits. But I felt like if this was something that was written today, I would want a little more effort put into justifying why that word is appropriate for something that is totally fictional. Because the flip side of this is the weirdness that comes with equating something supernatural with disability. Anyway, so there's that. I didn't really love the romance because, in this book at least, every time Sookie and Bill are intimate, it is during a time that she is particularly vulnerable. You know, it's like after a funeral or like right after she escapes being killed or something, and it's like it's every time. I'm not cool with that. The murder mystery part was interesting, but I wish like that had been the focus of the book rather than a thing that we return back to when we need to add a little bit of tension. Anyway, I can see why people like it. It doesn't really hit enough of what I would like in something like this. I'm not really interested in continuing with the series. I'm glad to have read it for frame of reference. I enjoyed it, but like it just had some issues where I'm like, I'm not hooked. Next one I have many thoughts about. I wish I had like done like a reading vlog for this. I might want to like make a whole video about this. Anyway, so this is The Lady's Handbook for Her Mysterious Illness by Sarah Ramey. This is a memoir. I pretty much exclusively read this on audiobook, and I think the audiobook is really the way to go because there's some like writing quirks. There's a lot of like repetition of certain words and themes and a lot of like line breaks that make reading it a little bit weird, but when you hear it narrated, it makes perfect sense. So anyway, it was narrated by Eileen Stevens. So anyway, I really appreciate what this book was trying to accomplish, but I am really uncomfortable with some glaring omissions in the subject matter. And this book was published in 2020. I'm not sure, I don't remember when in 2020, but it's new. So this is a very detailed medical memoir that follows the author's decade-long battle with many hard to diagnose chronic illnesses, and her advice for other WOMIs, women of mysterious illnesses. Trigger warnings for graphic depictions of illness, medical procedures, medical malpractice, sexism, and trans-exclusionary language. Let's see. So I mentioned the audiobook was great. So the author very clearly states that she wants this memoir to be a message to other WOMIs that they are not alone, and to present all of this information. She has a lot of research that she has done in doing a lot of work that modern medicine wasn't willing to do for her. She presents all of this information that she has researched and put the pieces together. She presents it just for the reader to consider what is wrong or missing in our current modern medicine. And with that, I think the book is very successful. So the flip side of that goal that is glaringly lacking is that she just flat out ignores all of the disability rights activism of the past several decades that have worked to try and accomplish many of the things that she says need to change in our world. Like, she presents that as if it's a novel idea, but it's like, no, there are people who have been working at this exact same thing for decades, and you don't mention them at all. Also, in terms of good things, I think there is a lot of value in the brutal honesty and detail the author serves in recounting her medical experiences. She very much challenges the social norm of not talking about our bodies, particularly women's bodies, in public spaces, and shows that secrecy just enhances the feeling of isolation that is common among many people with chronic illness. Okay. How do I hold this without making my shoulder cramp? I gotta put this down for a second. It's heavy. So she goes into great depth regarding the cultural sexism at play in her struggle, not just the overt sexism of male doctors not believing in the symptoms of their female patients, but in like the deep subliminal sexism that's at the very roots of our society, specifically like American society. But the vocabulary of the book adheres strictly to gender binary. It's always men and women. And then there is this chapter where she starts talking about like traits that are masculine and feminine. And she kind of is distilling everything down into these two categories. And she just kind of doubles down on this binary in a way that really feels trans-exclusionary. Again, like, this book was published recently. Like, I think the only acceptable reason for like excluding trans and non-binary perspectives in this conversation would be to acknowledge that finding relevant data or anecdotes was even more difficult than the data that she had to acquire for this story, like just regarding cis women, because this is like a lot of like chronic illnesses, particularly autoimmune disorders, they are a new illness. Like, they're in the span of like human medical discovery, they are new, and there's just not a lot of research beyond personal anecdote out there. So like, I feel like at the very minimum this book needed some kind of acknowledgement of like, there is this whole other aspect to this, but like I couldn't find enough to do it justice in this book at this time or something. But like, she didn't include that perspective or like any acknowledgement to it at all, and so it just feels like erasure. It was weird. It was real weird. I've seen some criticisms in other reviews about like she's presenting all of this like medical hoo-la-la and research and stuff, but she doesn't cite any sources, so like, how are we supposed to trust her? And it's like, well, this is a memoir. It's not investigative journalism. It's not science nonfiction. It's memoir. So like, that standard of cited sources and everything is like, that's not the same standard that this book needs to adhere to. And like, and it's stated like in the author's intent, she doesn't ask you to take all of her research as fact, but to consider it as a guide for exploring new options in healthcare treatment and to bring attention to an area of medicine that is new. So in a similar vein to like the binary language, where like the author kind of comes right up to the issue but never really quite acknowledges this glaring related issue, the author never really acknowledges the compounding factors of like race, poverty, and other privileges in the American healthcare system and in her own experience. Like, she has like a few sentences in there about like how she's super fortunate to like have parents who were doctors, and acknowledging that like how much diet is a huge factor in treating these chronic illnesses, and you know how poverty can play into that, but like it's so minuscule. I don't feel like she acknowledges it enough. Like, I know that we are supposed to be focused on her own story, but you know, it like the problem is not just that like this illness is new and we don't know how to treat it yet. The problem is also all of these other societal factors that keep poor people poor and keep sick people sick, and etc. And again, it was just like, and it wouldn't have been so bad if she really had acknowledged that she was just focusing on her story and her experience. But there's times where she like comes right up to the edge of talking about the issue and then just doesn't. Like, I don't know how else to describe it. I'm like hesitant to recommend it to people, but I feel like I want people to know about it, and I definitely want to do further reading into this subject because like it's really interesting, but I feel like there's probably going to be other stuff that feels more inclusive or feels more well-rounded. The next book I borrowed from my library, this is The Well of Ascension by Brandon Sanderson. This is the second book. This is the second book in the Mistborn series. My feelings are kind of meh for most of the book. I know that it's like much slower and like much more political, but like it wasn't quite political enough for me if that was what it was going to do. But the final 20% was great. Again, like with the slowness of it, like we just spend a lot of time sitting in a siege and thoroughly combing over every sentence of some lore about the deepness and the Well of Ascension. And I kept trying to like read into the parts that were repeating, trying to be like, can I figure this out? But like, I don't think we are actually given enough information to be able to figure stuff out ahead of time. So it just feels like you're hitting your head against a wall with no indication of whether or not the wall is going to crack. I didn't love it. So this is now 2 out of 2 books of Brandon Sanderson's that I've read where most of the magic is very combat based, which I like. I think it's well done. It's not my favorite. I think that's why my favorite parts of this world so far are learning more about the Kandra and the Terracemen ferrochemists, and I hope in the final book we get to learn more about the magic that creates the Inquisitors. Like, this is a common theme of me when a beloved book kind of falls flat. It's like, well, the thing that I found interesting was like this small thing on the side. Anyway, I've got the 3rd book on hold. I'll at least finish out the series. It's not my favorite. But like, it's interesting. I see the hype. Cool. Okay. The next book I finished was Transcription by Kate Atkinson. This was another one that like I just picked up the audiobook to try and like get through the book faster. This was narrated by Fenella Woolgar, and I think the narrator again like brought a lot of life and character to the writing that I feel like I would have missed just by reading it. This was a book that I purchased for my father-in-law because he reads a lot of political espionage, military spy thriller stuff, and that genre is a very old white man's game in terms of authors. So I was trying to find like a female author, an author of color, just being like, hey, let's try let's try something new instead of reading the same like 3 authors over and over again. So this one is definitely less Jack Ryan and more Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy by Jean Le Carré. The miniseries, not the movie. I haven't read the book yet. It's very elegant. It's definitely a story about like how a female spy moves through the world as opposed to a male-centered narrative. The action is very like tense conversations rather than like fistfights or whatever. So like I can see how this is very well done for its genre, but I feel like it is a very specific subgenre that I don't think this hit the mark for him. I don't think it quite hits the mark for me either. But it's like a spy thriller that's just like a really low simmer the whole time. But yeah, if you have recommendations for military, political, espionage thrillers that kind of shake up authors that dominate that field, let me know. Or like, if you know like if you know a YouTube creator who tends to read those kinds of books, because my feed is full of people who read a lot of YA and fantasy. Okay. Alright, so the next one I finished was Johnny Hazzard by Eddie de Oliveira. This was an amnesia read. This is a book that I had read. Couldn't remember a damn thing about it, and my gut instinct was that I would unhaul it, and I ended up really loving it. I got totally sucked into the story, and I read this in one sitting. So this follows 15-year-old American Johnny Hazzard on his yearly trip to visit his dad, who lives in London, and his coming-of-age experience during that summer with his first sexual relationship with an 18-year-old girl. So at first I was kind of feeling meh about it. It just seemed like a really well-done, detailed nostalgia trip about being a teenage boy in the early 2000s. And at first, like, I really didn't like the progression of Johnny's relationship with the girl January. She seemed very poorly written. And then I realized that that was on purpose. January is a very flat character. She doesn't really have any goals or any real personality of her own, because that is how Johnny sees her. There's going to be a little bit of spoilers on this. Like, this book is like 20 years old. And like it's on nobody's radar. It's on no one's TBR list. Like, my spoilers are going to be kind of vague, but like in order to tell you like what was so fucking genius about it, I have to like get a little spoilery. Anyway, that's how Johnny sees her. It's like not through any fault of his own. It's just his inexperience. He can't see her as anything more than this amazing thing that is happening to him. And this is all the more noticeable once I realized that all the other female characters were well-written and well-developed and, you know, had their own interesting character arcs. Like, even his mother, who is mostly off-page, we still learn enough about, like, her history and her progression. So, like, once I realized that, I'm like, oh no, this thing with January is not an accident. It's not that he can't write women, because he clearly can. This has a point. So then as the book goes on, we start to get like these single sentences, single phrases that are actually January's true feelings, and they really kind of shake up what Johnny has told us about this relationship. She is obviously not as equally infatuated with Johnny as he is, and the romance arc is this journey of the elation of first love and the crushing defeat that is his first breakup. Alright. And then there's a major side plot in the middle of the story that kind of threw me for a loop, where Johnny and his family take a tour of some World War I historical sites on mainland Europe, and we literally follow Johnny's feelings of initially being like bored and restless and being like, why the fuck did you just abandon the romance plot for this like weird family vacation history thing? And then we are with Johnny, acknowledging the impact of standing on these sites where thousands, if not millions, of young men died. And it perfectly encapsulates Johnny's coming-of-age moment, where he is becoming aware of how much of the world he doesn't know. And the knowledge is immense and amazing. And this is a great contrast to January, who at 18 has just finished a gap year of travel, and she exhibits the youthful arrogance that comes with someone who has gained a little bit of knowledge and now feels like she knows everything. So it's interesting to see that, like, she might be developmentally older than Johnny, but in terms of actual adult experience, she is not much more of a child than he is. And I really appreciate that because it made their age gap feel less weird. Anyway, so I was not expecting to read so much into this and really, really enjoy this. And this makes me really, really excited to go back and reread Eddie de Oliveira's other book, Lucky, because that is one of my favorite childhood books of all time, and I've kind of been scared to reread it in case it doesn't hold up, because I'm pretty sure that one was the first book I had ever read with bisexual representation, and for a long time it was the only book I've ever read with bisexual representation, particularly of a young male protagonist. So upon rereading this, I'm like, oh, I feel better that the other one is going to hold up as well. So, hurrah. Yay. Okay. So the next book I picked up was this little nonfiction called The Reason I Jump by Naoki Higashida, translated by K.A. Yoshida and Dave Mitchell. Actually, I'm going to talk about this and this in another book. Because so this book, and then The Tale Teller by Anne Hillerman, and then an ebook of Eden's Shadow by Emmett Swan. I talk about these more at length in my last reading vlog. I will link that in the description box below. So I'm pretty much gonna... This one was definitely the standout of those three books that I read. This is an Own Voices book about living with autism, and I have actually seen this book recommended by people with autism. And it's written by when the author was 13 years old, and it's kind of written in like a question and answer format where the author just addresses certain questions people have about the behavior of autistic people, particularly children. The intro is quite patronizing. I don't love it, and I've seen that critique of this book before, but I feel like the meat of the book is worth your time. It's super short, and like the writing is beautiful. Like, apart from like it being like really honest and insightful, like this author can write very beautifully and creatively. It's great. All right, and then again, The Tale Teller by Anne Hillerman. I listened to this on audiobook. It was fine. it was fine. It was forgettable. The villains are kind of like cartoony evil when we finally get to them. Nothing to write home about. And then Eden's Shadow by Emmett Swan. This was a book that I got a free ebook copy from a Goodreads giveaway. It narrowly escaped being a 1-star because the premise was interesting, but I have a review of this on my Goodreads, and I love to hate it in that vlog. We'll just leave it there. And then, by contrast, the next book I read was another book that I won in a Goodreads giveaway, and this one's actually a new release. And I wish I had like been able to get this video out before talking about it. But anyway, so that is The Intimacy Experiment by Rosie Danan. This was published on April 6th. So I fucking love this. This is a romance. It's got a bit of steam in it, but I wouldn't classify it as an erotica. So this follows former adult performer Naomi Grant as she gets hired by the young, new, very attractive rabbi Ethan Cohen, I believe, to hold some seminars on the topic of modern intimacy in order to draw new members into his struggling synagogue. I really loved the tension between Naomi and Ethan. There's just a lot of like, will they, won't they? I love that we see Naomi struggle with the barriers that she has put up due to her personal history and her line of work. She's got some great practical tips for modern dating, but she also acknowledges that this process requires you to be vulnerable in a way where you can get hurt, and you can never avoid all the hurt. You just have to figure out how do you fend off the worst of it. I also really, really loved the intersection of religion and faith in modern life. There's a line that says, "Maybe that's why intimacy pairs so well with religion. The best we can do is show up and try to be worthy." But this is not a story about conversion. It merely uses religion as a particular source of societal wisdom to guide us in realizing that we're not the only person who's ever gone through this, and you don't have to suffer or struggle alone. I liked it. I loved it. I've definitely heard that this one is way better than the first book in this romance series called The Roommate, but I am interested in like reading The Roommate, mostly because like I want the context of like what happened in this story before we got to this point. So yeah, definitely. I tried to see if this was Own Voices in terms of the Jewish representation, and I couldn't find any information one way or the other about the author, which that if the author doesn't want to make that information public, like with their heritage or their religious affiliation, like we are not entitled to that. But it just means that like I cannot say for sure whether or not this book is Own Voices. But I bring that up especially because May is Jewish Heritage Month, along with other celebratory things. So on that note, another author of Jewish heritage that I read, I listened to the audiobook of Being Human, an Unrepentant Memoir of a Disability Rights Activist by Judith Heumann and Kristen Joyner, narrated by Ali Stroker. So this Judith Heumann is a very well-known activist. There's a Drunk History episode about the sit-ins that she helped to organize to get various disability rights legislation passed. And she was, I don't know what the political affiliation was, but she was hired by the Obama administration to like oversee some department related to disability rights and accessibility. I think she's still alive. Anyway, so this is her memoir. I love her depictions of her early life. Her descriptions of her early life really just clearly show that different doesn't have to be. She is a paraplegic, is that the word? Due to contracting polio as a child. So she can't walk and she has limited use of her arms. I found the writing to be detailed, it was heartfelt, it was engaging. When we get into her really major activist accomplishments, I love how she shows that how much any activism movement is strengthened by connecting with other groups and movements. The famous sit-ins, they utilized community members from the Black Panthers, Vietnam veterans, anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, workers' unions, faith ministries. Notably absent was representation from the women's movement, and that is something that is still true today in many cases. Upon listening to this, I didn't realize that the ADA was only passed in 1990. I thought it was a little bit older than that, at least. And I appreciated the conversation that one of the major arguments against it and other disability accessibility policies was the financial cost. And Heumann points out that no other civil rights movement has ever been questioned because of cost, at least up to this point. I loved the discussions about the concept of health and quality of life. It's not just about healthcare, but it's must include all aspects of life, including housing and education and employment. And we all need to care about this because disability is an inevitable part of aging for all of us. That was a very humbling realization. Like, it was something that, like, I kind of knew, but, like, to have it phrased like that was like, yep. Yep. Okay, great. I need to point out that one of Heumann's signature goals was to close down special ed schools and get students into regular classrooms so that they would actually be expected to learn and be held to a similar learning standard as their able-bodied counterparts. Hold on to that thought. That's going to be relevant for another book that I read later on. I am not used to talking this much. My voice always gets kind of raspy in these videos. Sorry, y'all. Okay, so the next book I read that I had a physical copy of, and this is one of the few books that the bookstore actually bought. This is Across the Nightingale Floor by Leanne Hearn. This is the first book written in the Otori series. Chronologically, it's the second book now, because there is like a prequel book. So this was another amnesia read. I remember loving this as a teenager, and I really couldn't remember anything about it. This is a book about feudal Japan with some bordering on magic, assassin power stuff. The author is white. They definitely show that they love Japanese aesthetic and have thoroughly researched it. Anyway, so it's an adult novel, but it has a lot of things in it that appeal to a YA audience. I think that's probably why I was drawn to it as a teenager. The protagonist's inner struggle of his peaceful upbringing clash with his desire for revenge and his destiny to become an assassin. This is very much presented as like one or the other. There's like not really any explanation of how both aspects of him can live together. So that's kind of shows that like character development wise, there's not a lot of depth like what you would find in a more developed adult novel. Totally forgot that the romance was complete insta-love. I did not like that. It's just like, oh, your attraction to each other is you're two horny teenagers staring at each other across the room. That is the sum total of that development. I'm not here for it. The female character, the female protagonist, Kaede. I don't know how to say that. Kaede was introduced as such a strong and clever character, and then that kind of just disappears. She spends most of her time in a distressed, wasting away weakness, bemoaning her lack of power because she's a woman, but she's also like the heir to the only like fiefdom that inherits through the woman's line, so she actually does have power. I don't know. She does have like a significant plot action at the end, but it still feels really unsatisfying. The villains are so cartoony. Like there is no attempt to get to know these villains, one, or get to know like what are their reasons behind their actions at all. We're just like, even like this ally who comes in at the end to save them, like he is clearly set up to be a future villain, and it's just like I need my villains to be more well-rounded than that. I unhauled this whole series, so that was 5 books gone from my bookshelf in one go, and I have 0 regrets. The next book I finished, I enjoyed a lot more, so I listened to the audiobook mainly of Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City by Matthew Desmond, narrated by Dion Graham. So the author is a sociologist, and in this book he follows 8 families as they each struggle to keep a roof over their heads. Some are single, some have children, and one narrative follows a landlord family. I really appreciated the author's notes at the end regarding how he went about researching and writing this book. So he talks about how he immersed himself into these communities and the lives of the people he follows. And, you know, he literally like rents a trailer in the trailer park. He rents a room in these like slum apartment buildings. And then just like really slowly and genuinely tries to, if not necessarily become a friend, be like a trusted person for these people to talk about their lives with. He tried to be like a trustworthy but neutral party, but sometimes he did get involved, and like in the notes at the end, he acknowledges what some of those actions are, such as, you know, renting a moving truck for a family so that they don't, again, lose all of their possessions when they have to move. Also, he notes that he had a car and none of the people that he interviewed had a car. So a lot of equity of, you tell me your story, I'll give you a ride somewhere, and like, you know, it's not that like their relationship had to be fully transactional, but it was like, you're giving me something, let me give you something. Like, this is how human beings should interact with each other, of like, you give what you can. When you have something to share, you give what you can. There weren't too many ideas in this book that were like really new to me. I live in a city that has an affordable housing crisis, so a lot of these issues are already on my radar. But there were a lot of anecdotes and statistics that did flesh out what knowledge I already had. There were like 2 ideas in particular that like, they weren't necessarily new, but they kind of crystallized into words, some very vague gut feelings I had. So we talked about how like slum landlords are not necessarily born out of greed, and we're talking about like small business landlords, not people who are working for a property management company or people who have inherited wealthy properties. A lot of times like the slumlord situation is born out of treating housing as a for-profit business rather than a basic human need that must be met across the board. And you know, I was thinking a lot about this because in this past year, I was seeing a lot of discussion regarding tenants' relationships to landlords, regarding like rent moratoriums. And I saw a lot of comments that were just kind of dismissing and regarding landlords as like wealthy by default because they were property owners. And that like the tenants shouldn't be responsible for and the tenants shouldn't be the ones responsible for the landlord's lack of planning for not having like money set aside in case of an emergency. Let's remember that like this past year was an emergency of a scale that very few people were actually prepared for. Anyway, I think this book kind of challenges that rhetoric of like landlords are wealthy and they're just out there to take all your money or whatever. Because this book illuminates that it's really, the problem is really a broken system that serves to exploit the poor on both sides. Again, like I said, like when you treat a human right like a business, shit gets fucked up. You know, we see it in education, we see it in healthcare, we see it with food instability, and we're seeing it with housing. Anyway, okay, continuing. I also really appreciated the discussion around the role stable housing plays in community safety and stability. There is less crime, exploitation, and fewer disturbances in neighborhoods where the residents feel connected and involved. Like, how can you care about your neighbors when you view your presence there as temporary? Anyway, so great, lots of really interesting stuff to think about. And he does include a couple of solutions that are in the works for how to start to address this problem. Like one of them is like a program that pairs tenants with a lawyer when they go to eviction court. Because a lot of times the landlords have lawyers and the tenants don't, and they just don't know how to navigate that system, and they don't really know what all their rights are and what their options are. Anyway, it's a great read. The writing is engaging. I really like the audiobook. It's a balanced blend of research data and personal story. There was a reason that it was a winner of the Pulitzer Prize. So, huzzah. All right. So the next book I read was Mistress of the Art of Death by Ariana Franklin. Again, like I mostly listened to this on the audiobook. This was narrated by Rosalind Landor. I also really like the audiobook. I think like the book itself is quite well written, but yeah, it's really amazing how the audiobook can really just round out a story. So this is a medieval historical fiction with a graphic forensic criminal investigation mystery. So trigger warnings for graphic depictions of death and corpses, child sex abuse, severe anti-Semitism, sexism, attempted sexual assault, and quite a scathing commentary on medieval Christian beliefs and practices. I mean, I don't know if that last one needs to be a trigger warning, but if you are a person of Christian faith going into this book blind, you might get caught off guard. Anyway, so I can recognize that this book is well done. The historical aspects seem thoroughly researched and well integrated, and there's some fictional license taken to explore the story of a female doctor performing forensic investigations with the technology and knowledge available at the time. I gave it 4 stars, but I decided to unhaul it. The bookstore obviously didn't buy it. The subject matter is just like a bit too dark for me to like really love it and want it to reread it. I've since discovered that there's like a couple other books in the series, so if I'm prompted to pick up like a medieval historical fiction, I'll keep this in mind, because like I did enjoy it. I'm just like, because I don't think I want to go through it again now that I know what happens. Do you want to mention like there's a heavy emphasis on anti-Semitism? A lot of the story revolves around false accusations that the murdered children were part of ritual blood sacrifice of the local from the local Jewish population. I feel like there was a good amount of characters advocating and defending the Jews, and even if like defending them was kind of for their own personal gain. And I think the Jewish characters were given a chance to be well-developed characters. Like, it's uncomfortable, but I came away feeling that it was fairly balanced, like, for the time period and the region the story takes place. Like, it's gonna be uncomfortable, but like, as good a depiction and outcome as could be expected while still being relatively historically accurate. Again, this is heavy. I'm going to put it down. There's also like a romance that develops in here. I'm not really a fan of it. I could really take it or leave it. Like, we spend too long with our protagonist methodically listing all of the reasons why this love interest is a decent man and deserves her interest. And it's like, yeah, I know. We get it. He's a decent guy. Glad to have reread it. That is all. Okay, so the next book I finished was Train Go Sorry by Leah Hager Cohen. This is a nonfiction I found in a free library. So this is investigative journalism that is a mix of memoir from the author and anecdotal stories from several students and teachers from the Lexington School for the Deaf, and it addresses a variety of topics related to deaf culture, such as the debate between oralism and recognizing sign language as a legitimate language, when it discusses like when ethnic heritage can clash or mesh with deaf culture, and like the intersection of deafness and poverty and so on. So the author, this is not own voices in the sense that the author is not deaf, but her context for this is her grandfather. She had a pair of grandparents who were both deaf and had hearing children. Her father was a teacher at the deaf school for many years and then became their superintendent. And then she herself speaks sign language and has worked as an interpreter. So this was really interesting in contrast to the events of being human. Because remember, like, school integration was a big part of Heumann's goals. So one of the stories we follow here is the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. It's pushing for the integration of disabled children into regular classrooms at any cost. And for deaf students, this often results in the erasure of their culture. And like, they make it clear, like, the issue is not necessarily like segregation, good or bad or whatever, but it's the quality achieved with that separation or the integration. Until we can guarantee equitable communication access for deaf students in hearing classrooms, then the integration is just going to result in a barrier to meeting deaf students' needs. So I think, like, it's not to say that Heuman's desire for integrated education was misguided. I think she would agree that the issue that they show is the issue is rooted in the systemic problem of policies and procedures being crafted without the leadership of those affected communities. You know, it's the mantra of nothing about us without us. And like, I see that a lot particularly in like disability activism, but like that's relevant to all, social justice activism. So it's like a mix of like policy history, and then there's a couple of specific students who we kind of just follow their life. It was really interesting. And like it's just like one of the only like little free library books that I want to keep, particularly because the library doesn't have a copy of it available. But I also kind of want to return this to the world. So I might, we'll see what I decide to do with it. But yeah, I found this really interesting. Great. Okay. All right. The next book I picked up in trying to read it quickly to see if I could sell it. This is The Misfits by James Howe. This was another amnesia read. I knew I'd read it. Couldn't remember anything about it. So this is a sweet middle grade story about a group of misfit friends who enact change in their school. So this touches on many issues. It talks about racism, freedom of speech, fat phobia, homophobia, death of a parent, tokenism in regarding to black students, white saviors and behavior. It perhaps suffers from trying to talk about too many issues, like some things feel kind of glossed over, but maybe that's fitting for a middle grade read where that age group is just starting to really understand all of these issues and to think critically about them. I really loved our protagonist's relationship with his dad. That was super sweet. Like, I feel like some of the discussions haven't really aged very well. This was written in 2001. But for, like, again, like, social justice issues 101, I think it's fine. It's kind of formulaic. I think it executes the formula well. So, yeah, this is an unhaul, but, like, I feel good. Like, if I go and end up putting this, like, in a free library or something, I feel good about putting this out into the world. Anyway, cute. Okay. So next, I had just bought this book from Goodwill, and then there seemed to be kind of a resurgence of people talking about it on BookTube, and that is The Power by Naomi Alderman. I picked up the audiobook of this maybe like halfway through, and it's also narrated by the author. I also liked the narration. I think that's one of the pluses about it. So this premise is: across the world, teenage girls awaken the ability to generate powerful electrical impulses, and they can awaken this power in older women. It's a speculative science fiction that imagines a world where the power dynamics between women and men are very quickly reversed. So I'm going to refer you to the video created by the brilliant Bowties and Books. They really get into it. They deserve the views. They say what the issues are with this book probably way better than I ever could. So please go check that out. So I will like say two things about this. There's like that saying of like absolute power corrupts absolutely, which I felt like maybe that was the theme that this book was trying to explore. But if it was, like, the execution failed. Like, there wasn't enough build-up or motivation for how the events actually played out in this book. And then also, kind of like a lady's handbook for her mysterious illness. So this book was written in 2016. So it's new enough that, like, what are you doing writing a book that explores aspects of gender in society without including any commentary or perspective of trans and non-binary people? We're not doing that anymore. Ooh, so the next book I picked up was from my library. This was Rosewater by Tade Thompson. Ultimately, I liked it. I think it's challenging, and I understand why it's got like really mixed reviews. The time jumps can be tricky. I would say it definitely lends itself more to like sitting down and really like dedicating time, like large chunks of time to it, so you really get immersed in the book when you sit down to read it. This book is also, like, more gross than I was expecting. Like, it's not a horror, but it has horror elements. So, if that's really not your thing, I can see how you can kind of get caught off guard. So this is, like, a science fiction that follows a man who has, like, some psychic abilities, and then, like, we're kind of discovering his relationship with this like alien biodome. This takes place in Nigeria. I really want to reread it, and I really want to like, I might want to get like a physical copy of it, because again, like with some of the time jumps, it would be easier to be like, oh, okay, we're in this time. Where did we leave off? How did we get here? And be able to like page back and reorient myself easier. This book really just gives you a lot of threads of things that are going on and doesn't really tie everything up neatly for you. So again, like, it's challenging, but I'm really intrigued. And it's like, it wasn't necessarily a 5-star for me, but I do really want to reread it. So like, okay. The last 2 books. Okay, great. So then I picked up 1,000 Splendid Suns by Khaled Hosseini, and then I mostly listened to it on the audiobook that was narrated by Atossa Leone. The audiobook's not good. It's really flat. It's really choppy. There is no added life in the narration. But this is a book that I just dedicated to when I was going on my walks, where I couldn't really get distracted from listening to the story. So I see what the hype is with this book and this author, but it is so much trauma. It is constant trauma, and there is no aspect or plot line that is like a life raft. It is just like constant trauma all the way through. The ending, while it's not happy, it is satisfying. I will say that. So I picked this up initially because I really enjoyed the stage adaptation. And I prefer the stage adaptation. It is very faithful to the original story. I think it really condenses Mariam's initial story, but like, I feel like all of the information gets conveyed to us eventually. And the design and that production had a beautiful visual and sound design, and I think that really brought out the beauty of the story. And somehow they managed to really clarify the evolution of the relationship between Layla and Mariam. If you ever see a stage adaptation going around for this, I recommend it more than the book. And it's like, I'm glad to have read it, but it's just the kind of historical fiction that I really, really struggle with. Where it's just so much realism, and it's like, man, I should have just read a memoir or read like a history nonfiction. Like, I'm just sad and angry and frustrated, and that's it. Like, I don't necessarily mind reading about difficult things, but like, give me a life raft, give me something else. It's not my genre. It's okay. Okay, last book. Great. So, also from a free library, I picked up this copy of A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. This was another amnesia read where I read this when I was like in my tweens. Didn't remember anything about it. So I definitely appreciate this more as an adult. The world building is meticulous and kind of slow and full of lore, rather than like learning about the world through action. Our protagonist is quite flawed from the beginning, and like the rise and fall of his pride is really the main conflict, rather than some epic battle against an external villain. I like the magic system, and I really love that the story emphasizes that like this recognized academic magic, it's not the only magic in the world, and in some parts of the world, the rules of this mainland magic start to unravel. I think like the great value of this series is not so much the story, but like the ways in which this story was groundbreaking for its time. It was written in 1968. There's a great like afterword from the author talking about the writing of this book in this edition. She mentions that like, hey, our protagonist is brown. His best friend is black. Most of the characters are POC. And I love that she mentioned that like she was kind of being like sneakily subversive. She just put these characters like that in the book. She didn't make a big deal out of them, and then the readers didn't really make a big deal. There's a little bit of tension in like the cover artwork, but like beyond that, she's like, I published a book with mostly black and brown protagonists in the 60s. And it became like an iconic series. I also love that Le Guin points out that there are no wars in Earthsea, no soldiers, no armies, no battles, which even today I think is like a really rare thing for a fantasy. I can see how it's just a style that's like not really, it's like a storytelling style that is kind of rare even today, and I can see how like a lot of people would struggle to connect to it, but I'm really glad to have reread it. And I'm really hoping that my parents still have my childhood copies at their house so I can at least finish reading the original trilogy. There are now 6 books in the series. When did that happen? Anyway. Okay, that's it. That's the video. If you made it to the end of the video, please comment with a purple heart. Anybody? Anyway, okay. What's my outro? I hope you have a good rest of the day. I encourage you to go out into the world and be curious. I will have a link to my other social media places in the description box below if you want to connect with me elsewhere. Yeah, I will catch you all in my next video. Bye!